In terms of what we were discussing in the previous lecture, we talked about South Asia, partly briefly, and Southeast Asia, and partly about East Asia, right? Southeast Asia and East Asia is what we have talked about. Now, what we will be doing today is we'll talk in brief. Firstly, let me take. So, I've given you a certain context about South Asia, something about Southeast Asia, and something about East Asia. You've already done Sri Lanka, right? So, in the context of Sri Lanka, the important thing to, I think it's echoing, right? So, yeah. So, in terms of Sri Lanka, the important thing to focus on, as you would have done, was a certain historical context of how the India-Sri Lanka relationship has evolved over time. And Sri Lanka is also a very classic example of how China wants to, perhaps establish itself as a major player in South Asia. Now, while people talk about China's intentions to establish itself as a major player in South Asia, Pakistan definitely comes across as a major example, especially in the light of the CPEC corridor and things around CPEC corridor. And questions in your mains examinations have also come around China's debt trap diplomacy or China's expansionism in South Asia, or how does increasing Chinese presence in South Asia pose challenges to Indian foreign policy. Many of these kind of questions have been framed from time to time. Now, what I want to discuss with you first today is particularly use your understanding of Sri Lanka, and first discuss the example of the Chinese presence in Sri Lanka, and more importantly, what have been the recent developments in the past 2 years in the India-Sri Lanka relationship. A lot has happened in the past 2 years in the India-Sri Lanka relationship, and in the light of that, there is an intense India-China rivalry to a certain extent which is ongoing in Sri Lanka. And to that extent, what happens in Sri Lanka will be watched. Now, what is to be understood is that what happens in Sri Lanka will be watched closely by India's other neighbors, which are a Bhutan, a Nepal, a Bangladesh, and many other players, in the sense of how serious is India or how willing is India to defend its overwhelming domination of the Indian Ocean region, or one could say how serious is India to tackle the Chinese rise in the Indian Ocean region. Now, here I want to also paint a broad context for you. देखिए, जो मैंने आपको कल बात बताई थी, geography is that important factor, and there is the Malacca dilemma, जिसके बारे में हमने we talked yesterday. Now, the context of the Malacca dilemma is also this, that it is often argued time and again that if India and China were to enter into a major military conflict, there is a very strong possibility that a future major military conflict, if it happens between India and China, may not happen over land. Instead, it may happen in the seas along the Malacca or along the Indian Ocean region. And to that extent, it is this possibility of a future potential conflict between India and China which makes both China as well as India increasingly concerned about maintaining their strong presence in the Indian Ocean region. And as I was saying yesterday, that there were articles also written that India and Chinese troops are not fighting each other in the Himalayas as much as they're fighting the harsh climate. So there is a very strong realization, and it has been a realization which has been there for a long time, that mobilizing troops from either side of the Himalayas at high altitudes is an increasingly difficult exercise, and also that will mean that no side will be able to quickly mobilize troops in a matter of days or weeks. For example, right now is the Ukraine conflict ongoing. You would have seen that within a matter of a couple of weeks, the Russians started mobilizing their troops, and from Russia into Ukraine, it is vastly a flat piece of land. So they've been able to simply walk into Ukraine, okay, which is not the case along the Himalayan buffer between India and China. Anyways, you can't cross over the mountains. The crossing can happen through passes. But even these passes are at very high altitudes. So both sides take a long amount of time to mobilize troops. Secondly, the weather is so harsh during winters, etc., that troops cannot be mobilized across long distances over time. Secondly, food supplies, fuel supplies, artillery supplies maintaining over long time, especially at high altitudes, is an even bigger challenge. Long story cut short, both sides largely understand that while they may assemble troops along the borders, these troops may not resort to a full-scale conflict in the Himalayas. What that means is that, and also no side has any major advantage over the other. Where? In the Himalayas. Though you may have read or heard that the Chinese have done better in terms of infrastructure in the Himalayas, etc., and they can mobilize troops faster, etc. All of that is true, but at the same point of time, all of that is largely irrelevant in the sense that however good their infrastructure may be, infrastructure overcoming the logic of geography is extremely unlikely. What is more likely is that if India and Chinese troops face off along the Himalayas, it can always spill over in the Indian Ocean region. There is a very conscious realization amongst policy makers, including amongst the Chinese, that if given their strong infrastructure along border areas, if they push India too much, India may resort to balancing against China, not on the mountains, but in the Indian Ocean region. So that is why it has been a big debate amongst Indian strategic thinkers that should India respond to Chinese aggressive in the Himalayas in the Indian Ocean region also or not. So that is why this Indian Ocean region is not just about Sri Lanka, it's not just about countries here and there. It is Indian Ocean region has a direct orientation to dealing with Chinese assertiveness, and it is not that we will try to put pressure on the Chinese along the Malacca only when there is contestation in the naval sphere. It is quite much possible that a contestation on the land border may trigger a confrontation in the naval sphere as well. That is why this naval sphere is so important. Historically, if you see, the Indian armed forces have been a land heavy army. Troops ज़्यादा हैं, both India and China. Okay, they both have one of the biggest armies in the world. And in terms of naval strength, the Chinese are increasingly building their naval strength. Why? Because if you look, some of the major powers of the world always have been strong naval powers. Before USA, it was Britain, the world's biggest naval power and also the world's biggest colonizer. Then came the United States, which is today the world's biggest navy with a large number of overseas naval bases controlling the major trade routes of the world. Now the Chinese look to take a larger role in South China Sea, in East China Sea, and protecting China's economic interests also, including through the Malacca Strait. So the Chinese are building up their fleet. The Chinese are trying to acquire ports far beyond Chinese territory, whether that is in Sri Lanka, whether that is in Pakistan, or in many other countries, in Djibouti, elsewhere, many other countries, which in Indian policy circles has been called as the string of pearls strategy. What the Chinese are looking to do is to expand their maritime presence beyond the South and the East China Sea into the Indian Ocean region. And the case in point of Chinese maritime strategy looking to expand itself into the Indian Ocean region, one of the classic examples is Sri Lanka, right? So मुझे ये बताइए, आप लोगों ने in Sri Lanka you've studied about that Hambantota port, this, that, वो सब Trichonamali and all that you've studied, right? So given that you've studied all of that, it should not take us much time. And so the question, if they were to give you a question in the mains examination, they're likely to give you a question like this. that, और इसी से आपको एक चीज समझ में आ जाएगा कि कैसे आंसर भी लिखना होता है, बिकॉज देयर इज दिस थिंग राइट कि हाउ डू यू गो अबाउट राइटिंग द आंसर्स थिंग. So in IR, answer writing is a fairly simple exercise. You'll kind of, in general studies, it's fairly simple. So if they were to give you a question like this, that in the light of the recent attempts by China to expand its maritime presence in the Indian Ocean region, discuss the key concerns raised by India and possible measures to address the same. In the light of, to address the same. Discuss the key concerns raised by India and the possible measures to address the same. Specifically in context of Sri Lanka. Specifically in context of Sri Lanka. देखिए, अब one of the things, if, and I'll do the writing, but you can write that with me later. But in terms of key points, when we talk about China, so one of the things is that Madam also, Shubhra ma'am also may have discussed briefly about the One Belt, One Road initiative, right? So the 2012 onwards, Xi Jinping's grand plan was to put in place the idea of the One Belt, One Road initiative, also initially called as the Belt and Road Initiative, also called as the Silk Route, the Maritime Silk Route, many other things. The idea of all of this comes from what China wants to do. वो आप सबने पढ़ा है कि ठीक है, wants to build a large number of ports, infrastructure, etc. in many other countries. The larger thing is why China launched the OBOR. There are often said that there are two broad complementary objectives. One is a larger strategic objective and the other is a economic objective. And often both of these very closely overlap. तो ये क्वेश्चन भी आया हुआ है मेंस में कि OBOR is not merely driven by economic imperatives but equally by the strategic imperatives of China. So there are strategic as well as economic forces or economic objectives that China seeks to achieve. What do we mean by strategic? Something which is driven by their long-term security or defense related objectives. Something which is driven by their long-term security or defense related objectives. And security or defense related objectives. And when you talk about these long-term security or defense related objectives of the Chinese One Belt, One Road initiative, including in the maritime sphere. The Chinese firstly want to expand their maritime presence, right? To do what? To safeguard what? To safeguard their ever growing. See, they are a largely export driven economy and they export goods to all over the world. So they want to ensure a safety of their trading ships, vessels and routes. So to safeguard their exports from threats which may emanate from where? Other states or non-state actors, from pirates to other states who may seek to threaten their trading activities. They want to safeguard that. So for that, the Chinese aim to expand their maritime presence to safeguard their exports from threats from other state or non-state actors. देखिए, for example, along the Horn of Somalia, along the Horn of Africa, along Somalia, piracy is a major threat. Now, if pirates start threatening Chinese ships, it is definitely going to negatively affect Chinese exports. So it's not just state, but also against non-state actors that they want to firstly safeguard their exports. So they are expanding their maritime presence. The other objective, the strategic objective that they seek to increase is that they want to establish their long-term presence in Indian Ocean region, which would help them to partly safeguard their interests in safeguard their interests and tackle the Malacca dilemma, and also it will allow them to do a very important thing, prevent USA from successfully having a group of first and second island chains which contains China within the South China Sea. देखिए बड़ा सिंपल सा है. If China doesn't expand into the Indian Ocean region, it will always remain vulnerable to the Americans through the first and the second island chain, preventing the Chinese Navy from going out of the South and the East China Sea. If a large part of the Chinese fleet is operating in the Indian Ocean region, then it can counter whom? देखिए बड़ा इसमें ज्योग्राफी समझने का बड़ा सिंपल सा है. You remember the first and the second island chain I talked about yesterday. So if suppose through all these military bases, the American Navy boxes the Chinese Navy in the South China and the East China Sea, the Chinese Navy must have operating bases beyond the South and East China Sea from where they can make a comeback. Where will be those bases? In the Indian Ocean region. So China wants to have a plan B ready to overcome a possible Malacca dilemma, partly vis-a-vis India, and also overcome the dilemma of the possible threat that can come from US allies boxing China in the South and the East China Sea. That is why Indian Ocean may they want to expand. So it's their large long-term security interest also which is in place. So they want to safeguard their interests and tackle the Malacca dilemma vis-a-vis India, and also ensure that USA does not curtail or does not limit Chinese naval presence in the South and East China Sea by maintaining a constant fleet, by maintaining by maintaining a constant fleet beyond the South China Sea in the Indian Ocean region. This explains the Chinese interest in having presence in Maldives, in having presence in Sri Lanka, in having presence in Gwadar and elsewhere. So this is what is their long-term security interest. Added to this, they say often add a third objective which is limited to this point or which is related to this Malacca dilemma also, is the string of pearls strategy to limit what जो आपने सुना होगा, that what you keep talking about, what the Chinese ultimate objective, that some of the American military strategists argued and Indians also strategic thinkers partly agreed to it, that the Chinese long-term aim is to have this string of pearls surrounding India through which the Indian Navy's ability to dominate the Indian Ocean can be limited. Which and why they want to limit India's domination of the Indian Ocean region? Because that adds to their Malacca dilemma. So obviously these points are interrelated. So if you were to add a third point here, the Chinese string of pearls strategy to establish overseas naval bases in the Indian Ocean region is driven by its desire the Chinese string of pearls strategy to establish overseas naval bases in the Indian Ocean region is driven by its desire to limit India's domination of the Indian Ocean region and thereby limit the threat posed by the Malacca dilemma. Thereby limit the threat posed by the Malacca dilemma. So these are the largest strategic reasons why they want to have a long-term presence in the Indian Ocean region, establishing a number of maritime bases across the Indian Ocean region. Now, this is partly where given the strategic objectives in the Indian Ocean region, but they have economic objectives as well. And the economic objectives is that China specializes, देखिए, the Chinese have always been exporting manufactured goods, right? The China is considered the factory of the world. It's been exporting manufacturing goods. However, now China, देखिए इसका भी थोड़ा सा हिस्ट्री है अगर आप समझें. China is partly learning from the American playbook. Okay, many students, for example, during World War II, Europe witnessed huge destruction. ये सर समझने के लिए बता रहा हूँ. Europe witnessed huge destruction during World War II, and Europe had to be practically rebuilt after World War II. Now, this rebuilding of Europe after World War II was partly or was to a certain extent financed by whom? The United States, by something that was called as the Marshall Plan. John Marshall was the one who gave this idea of something called as a Marshall Plan in USA, and USA said that we will provide something to the tune of 50 billion US dollars for reconstruction of whom? Europe. But there are no free lunches in the world. Nobody is going to provide 50 rupees also for free. Forget 50 billion US dollars. Okay. Now, this allocation, while was done, it was done keeping the larger objectives of US foreign policy in mind. That when US is going to provide such a huge financial aid, it will not be a financial support lacking conditionalities. In fact, there would be a number of conditions attached. One condition often would be that while implementing construction projects in in Europe, whether roads, railways, highways, whatever, US companies will be given preference, okay, by Europe to give US companies the contracts for implementing many of these projects. If USA is giving loans, firstly, this money was not given as aid. Some portion was aid. Aid is something which you don't need to repay, but a large part of it was loans. The US loans, however, were relatively soft loans, which were at a lower interest rate. But even while there were soft loans at low interest rates, while giving out these loans, USA attached explicit or unsaid conditionalities, where they said you have to favor US companies while giving contracts in Europe for construction of many of these projects. Or we will give you the aid, you reduce the tariff on automobile import from US. Okay. Yes, we will give you $1 billion in aid to build a building, but you should reduce the import duty on American automobiles by 30%. So all of this is always, अभी जैसे मैं अभी श्रीलंका का भी, if you look, the Triconamallee port, eventually India pressed hard for Triconamallee and said, look, if you don't give us Triconamallee, we will not give you a currency swap. It is as simple as this. The conditionalities are often there, and every country applies conditionality because aid, whether aid or loans, are a part of what we call as economic diplomacy. This is an example of economic diplomacy, that you are using economic tools to achieve the objective of your state. So every country uses economic tools, which can be aids, loans, or sanctions. For example, US applying sanctions on Iran is a part also of partly its economic diplomacy. So the Americans also did this kind of an economic diplomacy in Europe. America aided the reconstruction of Europe, but also in a manner which benefited American exports to Europe. Okay, so this is some degree of similarity which many countries follow. If the Chinese also would have been doing only this much, then this would not have been something which would mark a major shift from how great powers behave. Great powers who have financial muscle often follow such a route of economic diplomacy of giving aids, loans along with explicit and implicit conditionality. One of the classic example of Western powers imposing conditionalities while giving loans to developing countries is where? Forget OBOR. China is doing OBOR, right? But the classic example of Western countries imposing conditionalities on developing countries while giving loans is the example of IMF and World Bank. If you want a bailout package from IMF, open up your market. Open up your market to whom? To exports coming from West. They don't say exports coming from West, they say exports. But we know where are the exports coming from. Right? So conditionalities have often been attached directly or indirectly while giving loans as a part of economic diplomacy by Western countries also, either using international finance institutions like the IMF and World Bank or directly. And China also doing something like this may be considered partly as a repetition of the West, of what the West has done. However, the Chinese have added their own flavor to this process. They have gone maybe more in a more aggressive manner and beyond what partly the Americans and the Europeans have done, using these tools, using economy as a tool of foreign policy. Okay, and that the classic example is the One Belt One Road initiative. So isme, if you were to look at this, what they have done is that to ensure their economic, what have been their economic objectives? Their economic objectives have been to boost what? Chinese exports, whether that is to boost Chinese exports, whether that is of Chinese manufactured goods, and here manufactured goods does not mean only electronics and all that. It can mean, for example, Chinese steel, fertilizers, or Chinese expertise in what? Mega infrastructure projects. Where China seeks to speedily implement mega infrastructure projects and provide raw materials as well as labor for these projects. As you would have read, when the Chinese construct many of these mega infrastructure projects such as roads, dams elsewhere in Sri Lanka or any country, they want, what do they want to do? They want to, as I often say, the Chinese, for example, manufacture half of the world's steel is manufactured by only one country, China. Now China wants to export this steel. China also manufactures a large part of the world's cement. So the steel and cement, China is used in large measure for their domestic consumption, for building their own dams and roads and highways. Once that is done, which is now more or less done, they do not want to shut down these industries. They want to keep continuing production. So while they keep continuing production of these, they want to export these commodities. While exporting the commodities, China doesn't want to become merely an exporter of steel or cement, which will get it profits, but not as high profits if it goes ahead and implements the whole project in third countries. Because through this, Chinese will not just make economic gains. The Chinese will also, for these projects, be exporting their own labor and generating employment for Chinese workers abroad. So the Chinese are also looking at tackling their own unemployment problem by exporting labor also as a part of OBOR, and also continuing their export driven growth in the manufacturing and the construction sector, and use their expertise in completing mega infrastructure projects to make credible economic gains, okay, even in the future. So that's so they basically, it's not that they do not have an economic objective in mind. Their economic objective thus is overall to continue China's export driven economic growth, where in the manufacturing, construction sector. Now, whether manufacturing or construction, and here it can be roads, rails, highways, ports, elsewhere, har jagah. Highways, ports, etc., etc. So this is what they've been doing. The Chinese want to build high-speed railways in Malaysia. The Chinese want to build ports in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar. Roads, railways, highways, pipeline, जो आपको लग रहा है infrastructure, they want to build. Okay, because by building this itself, they are exporting their materials, as well as they are also generating employment for Chinese workers. Here is the difference. while conditionalities every country seeks to impose, the Chinese list of conditionalities is very long. If you want our loan for a dam, you have to buy the steel also from China, you have to buy the cement also from China, the Chinese workers will construct the project and it will be operated by China for these many years. Otherwise, will not give the loan. So the Chinese are not, it's not that they are not making any financial sense while extending these loans in most of the cases. And obviously the economic, while extending most of their, while even they extend their loans, these loans जो आपको पता है, they come at a high interest rate. Okay. तो ये broad context आपको पता है. Now these are, what are their objectives? देखिए मैं आपको पहले भी बताया था, whenever you read any issue, तो objectives आपको पता होना चाहिए. What are the objectives? What are the key features of their policies? What are the challenges? And what is the way forward? है ना? तो ये तो हो गए larger objectives. Now when we talk about what are, if this is, तो देखिए ये जो मैंने आपको अभी बताया, इससे आप क्या लिख सकते हैं? Using this, you can discuss this, the Chinese objectives is a matter of some concern for whom? India and other like-minded partners. Sorry, is a concern for India and some other like-minded partner. Now, for what are India's concerns is partly driven not just by the objectives of China, but the detailed features of what? Many of the projects sanctioned under OBOR. The features of the One Belt, One Road initiative, specifically in the light of, let's say, Sri Lanka as an example. Examples so kai hai, but Sri Lanka is a classic example because here almost all the concerns have been more or less validated. Meaning, it's not that those concerns are in thin air, but you see them in reality on the ground. Now, the features of OBOR is, which have been a matter of some concern, is firstly what India says, that many of these OBOR projects, China provides funds and loans for many of these projects, which are what? Clearly financially unviable. And by providing these loans, China, by providing these which are clearly financially unviable, China aims to fund or provide loans which are clearly financially unviable to where? Developing countries. Where? In the Indian Ocean region and beyond. Other areas, but definitely in the Indian Ocean region. And by extending these loans, many of which are financially unviable, when the recipient country would find it difficult to repay the loan, the Chinese would demand what you call as a debt equity swap. Bhai, you can't repay our debt, so give us a ownership of many of these projects. Like Hambantota, as we have read, that they said that okay, initially $1.5 billion at a loan of $1.5 billion was required by whom? For the construction of Hambantota port, also at a very high interest rate of 6%. Once the loan was taken and the construction began, the project was found to be unviable, also for a multitude of reasons. One is that the Colombo port itself is a big port. There is no need for another big port in Sri Lanka. And still, the Chinese gave the loans, the Sri Lankans took it. Once the project became unviable after construction, the Chinese said, give us the lease for 99 years and we will, out of $1.5 billion, $1 billion loan, we will, what? We will waive off. But in that return, you give us the lease for the Hambantota port for 99 years. It's almost a debt equity swap. You can't repay our debt. So give us a long-term ownership or operational control of a particular project. Okay. So this is the debt trap which is being laid out for many a number of developing world countries. The classic example is Sri Lanka. So I'm not writing the example in detail, but Hambantota you know anyway, so I don't need to repeat. Right? The example of Hambantota and the high interest rates. Now, here is one thing, जो शायद आपने पढ़ा हो कि नहीं. Why is it that that some of these countries, so this is one feature. Why is it that some of these countries would accept loans at high interest rates for projects which are unviable? Why? Because there is corruption and poverty. Okay, there's corruption and poverty, or these are developing countries where there is an infrastructure deficit, and so they are willing to take loans at high interest rates. Okay, that's one explanation, and which is not an incorrect explanation, which is a part of the explanation. Anything else you can think of? Lack of technology. Okay, yes. Somebody was saying something here. Unreasonable conditions from IMF. For example, what he's saying is the West has also always imposed conditionalities. Okay. And to that extent, while imposing many of these conditionalities, the West have also demanded certain favors or opening up of the markets in return for extending loans. Right. So there is a certain amount of, one could say, disenchantment with the West, right? So that's the reason. The other is they don't have technology. Okay, they don't have. Developing countries are facing certain constraints in terms of technology, manpower, financial resources. That is why they're willing to take loans. But even while you take loans from a bank, you also want to take loans from a bank. You don't want to take it at an exorbitantly high interest rate, which you may find it difficult to repay. So, while these are reasons why any country would seek loans, but willingly knowing that these loans will be difficult to repay and still taking those loans, what explains this? What you are saying explains why countries would take loans, but why would they take loans at such high interest rates? One explanation could be that you don't have many other alternatives who are willing to give you loans. Right? That can be one thing that you can think of. But can you think of something else? For economic development, they'll get money so that they can boost their exports. That's all fine. Or they want to build a good relationship with that country. I'll explain you the reason why many of the recipient countries are willing to take such high or loans at relatively higher interest rates. There are two broad reasons, which again, while देखिए एकदम simple था, while there are strategic and economic objectives of donor country being met, जो ले रहा है उसके भी कोई objectives हैं दिमाग. Okay, one objective, for example, in the classic case of Sri Lanka, is an example that in the recipient states, most of these developing countries, recipient states, do not have a very strong system of parliamentary or democratic scrutiny of these projects. ये शायद आपने पढ़ा हो चाहे नहीं पढ़ा हो. In the case of Hambantota also, or in the case of many other projects like the Matala airport, the Hambantota, when these projects, the Chinese were willing to fund these projects in the Sri Lanka, in Colombo, in the parliament, the question was raised Why are you taking loans at such high interest rates? Okay, it would be difficult to service. The Sri Lankan government imposed an emergency and in 2 days passed the bills. What is often not understood is that any aid or loan, when taken by a country with a strong democratic checks and balances, will always demand a scrutiny. ऐसे नहीं समझ में आ रहा, सिंपल. इंडिया बॉट राफेल फ्रॉम फ्रांस, हो हल्ला हुआ. This is called scrutiny. That scrutiny of any major economic deal or defense deal often ensures that the ruling party cannot take the country for a ride. Okay, I don't know whether you have studied this or not, or maybe you're not. I often say Sri Lanka today is a tale of Rajpakshas. राजपक्षा के आगे राजपक्षा, राजपक्षा के पीछे राजपक्षा. कितने राजपक्षा? 3 राजपक्षा. Mahindra Rajpaksha, Gotabaya Rajpaksha, Basil Rajpaksha, and now their son, Mahindra Rajpaksha's son, is the 4th. अभी वो आ रहा है छोटे अभी. It is on record to show that the Chinese funded the Rajpaksha's electoral campaigns in 2014 and even before that in 2009. And since have been a strong funding, have provided strong funding to the Sri Lankan SLPP, the Sri Lankan People's Party, which is under the Rajpakshas. And the Rajpakshas have been keen to strengthen their relationship with the Chinese because it strengthens their domestic position. It's simple, they are providing them funding for fighting election. And that is one reason why they are willing to take loans from China. So much so, I don't, if you know well and good, both Hambantota and Matala, which are located in southern Sri Lanka, are the domestic constituencies of whom? Mahindra Rajpaksha. Very simple. They said, बना दो airport और बना दो port, क्योंकि ये यहाँ की इनकी constituency है. So there is often political corruption and lack of strong checks and balances in many of these developing countries, where democratic scrutiny of such projects is often lacking. When India signed the India-US civil nuclear deal, there was intense scrutiny in the Indian Parliament. Debate went on from 8 a.m. in the morning till 11 p.m. in the night. Okay, so countries where there are strong checks and balances, there will always be strong scrutiny of mega projects, so that mega projects do not become mega projects with mega corruption. But that's often lacking in many of these countries. Look at Nepal, look at Bhutan, look at Pakistan, look at Myanmar, look at Sri Lanka. In many of these countries, the Chinese have found it easy to finance many of those projects because the political elites are willing to toad or willing to establish good relations with the Chinese because of the kickbacks they receive from the Chinese. And there is no strong checks and balances in these countries. Herein comes the second fear, that the Chinese through the OBOR projects are not just serving their own strategic and economic objectives. They are strengthening the hands of authoritarian rulers in many of these countries. Okay, so in many of these countries, developing countries, if you have the benevolence of the Chinese, if you have good relations with the Chinese, Maldives is another example, you can overcome your political opponents in your domestic politics and continue to have a major hold over your domestic politics. So often some of the political elites in many of these countries have shown the inclination to go ahead and sign such deals. That's one reason. The second reason is China doesn't argue or ask for any China, और ये आपने श्रीलंका के केस में पढ़ा होगा. Otherwise, I'm just telling. While extending loans, the West is saying freedom of speech, democracy, multi-party election, ये सब होना चाहिए. You know, respect human rights, all of that. China is like, no such conditionalities. You do genocide, for all I care. You take the loan, you take my cement, you build the project, give me the port, you do whatever you want. You want funding for election, I'll do it. Okay. So this is the reason why many of the political elites in recipient countries are willing to take those loans, because it strengthens their domestic political position. And in the absence of any strong checks and balances, there is no larger debate or scrutiny in many of these countries over the impact of such projects, or over whether the government in the recipient countries must take such projects. This is the broad context. What is India's concerns? Now, what are India's concerns? If these are the features, that the Chinese will have a long-term presence in these countries. That's one. The second is the Chinese funding and intervention will strengthen the hands of authoritarian rulers in many of these countries. Okay. For example, in Sri Lanka, the Rajapakshas today are left, right, center everywhere. Okay. And this is something which is not a coincidence, because they have been strongly backed by whom? The Chinese. The Chinese showed their backing for the Rajapakshas during 2009 to 14 also, when in United Nations resolutions were introduced against the Rajapaksa regime for war crimes committed during Ilam War 4, or the final phase of the Ilam War. India voted, aapne padha hoga, India voted in UNHRC against Sri Lanka. That in the United Nations Human Rights Council, India voted against Sri Lanka because of the fact that the Sri Lankan army was accused of killing large number of Tamilians in the final phase of the Tamil Wall 4, who was killed? Prabhakaran. देखिए कुछ नहीं है, एकदम सिंपल है. 2009 to 14 आप देखिए, as I said, Rajapakshas, तो ये सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट है महेंद्र राजपक्षा. He came to power in 2005. 2009 तक he did what? He eliminated the LTT. In the last year, in 2009, when he eliminated the LTT, a large number of Tamil civilians in northern Sri Lanka were killed. Apart from the LTT militants, a large number of civilians in northern Sri Lanka who were Tamils were also killed. There was a strong demand for investigation into war crimes committed by Rajpaksha. India voted against Sri Lanka on this matter, but the Chinese supported Rajpaksha. So that's what I'm saying, that they have no concern about human rights or authoritarian rulers ruling, and to that extent, many of the Chinese are more than willing to support authoritarian rulers in many other countries. इसका एक कंसर्न और मैं आपको बता दूं, it's not a coincidence that capitalism, it is not a coincidence that US is a capitalist country also, and it's a democracy also, to the extent that US, wherever US money goes, it wants to support democracies. Okay, whereas the Chinese are no big fanboys of democracy anyways. Okay, देखिए एक चीज बार बार कही जाती है, इंडिया और चाइना के बीच में एक बहुत बड़ा एक आइडियोलॉजिकल रेस भी है. ओके, व्हाट इज दैट आइडियोलॉजिकल रेस? दैट चाइना इज a $13 trillion economy with a communist regime, whereas India is a $3.5 or $3 trillion economy with a democracy. So to the ASEAN and the developing world, similarly, if you look at USA, democracy and $16 trillion, right? That is the US economy. So to ASEAN, or ASEAN anyways is still very well developed. But if you look at the whole of Africa, the future of Africa is partly dependent on this rivalry between a US and China. If China wins, for example, China is under the OBOR, is financing a large number of projects where? In African countries. In fact, China is increasingly becoming the biggest player in Africa. Does that mean good news for democracy in Africa? Already there are not very strong checks and balances in African countries. Previously, the Americans have also supported military coups in a number of African countries, but the Chinese have no reason to get involved on human rights, military coups, democracy, freedom of speech. वो वहीं अपने यहाँ नहीं देखते तो आप. So this is a concern also for like-minded countries like of India and other like-minded countries of what? Quad also. That if the Chinese were to have their way, then democracy will become a thing of past. Where? In the whole world. When the Chinese led order will arrive in this world, democratic orders will at least become less prevalent than they are right now. Okay? It's not a coincidence that the American led world order that expanded where? During the Cold War and afterwards also saw more and more countries becoming democratic. ये कोई कोइंसिडेंस नहीं है. उन्होंने भैया हमारा लोन चाहिए तो डेमोक्रेसी लाओ, हमारा लोन लो, जो करना है करो. They are willing to side with the ruling political elites and support many of such campaigns. So this is a concern for India even this way. तो देखिए इवन इन आंसर राइटिंग सिर्फ वही ढर्रा नहीं लिखना है. क्या सर डेट ट्रैप डेट ट्रैप डेट ट्रैप वो तो लिखना ही है, लेकिन these one or two more points also, because the more Chinese money flows into many of these countries, the more it will weaken democratic institutions and processes. It's as simple as this. Okay, that much is there. Unless countries already have strong processes in place, which are missing in most of the developing countries. Okay, so that's concern. So, so if I was to say what are India's concerns, right? What are India's concerns? India's concerns with OBOR thus are broadly two or three. One is that by resorting to debt trap diplomacy, the Chinese aim to establish their long-term presence in the Indian Ocean region and limit India's domination. Classic example, Sri Lanka and the Hambantota port, and Pakistan and the Gwadar. ये दो आपने पढ़े तो ठीक है. Next, India's concern is that Chinese funding for OBOR projects, Chinese funding for OBOR projects in developing countries weakens democratic institutions weakens democratic institutions and processes by interfering in domestic elections. For example, and this is not a conspiracy, I'm saying this is a proved fact in the case of Sri Lanka. For example, the Chinese state was found, there was evidence of the Chinese state funding the electoral campaign of whom? The Chinese state has a funding the electoral campaign of the Rajapakshas during 2014. And by extending loans or grants to states ruled by authoritarian rulers, without expressing concerns for human rights violation, the Chinese support often strengthens the hands of what? Authoritarian rulers. In India, any political party takes funding from China? No. In India, our politicians are very honest, corrupt. They are not corrupt, they are very honest. And they anyways disclose every year how they raise each and every penny of funding for elections through electoral bonds. When you will study and read about electoral bonds, I think this is the biggest contribution Mr. Jaitley did to Indian economy. सही सीन है, कहां से पैसा आ रहा है, कहां जा रहा है, कुछ नहीं पता. Next, so if this is clear, let's not. So if this is clear, they are doing what? See, there is definitely the aspect that this is coercive economic diplomacy, and with the larger strategic objectives in mind. So that is there. Whether you want to compare it to subsidiary alliance, that's another thing. But yeah. Pardon? India? So that is the case. In case of CPEC, there is an additional concern that it is violating India's territorial sovereignty, that it is passing through Indian territory. The China-Pakistan economic corridor is passing through the Gilgit-Baltistan region, which India claims as a part of its territory, and so that's an additional concern with CPEC. That is one of the reason also why India is not joining BRI. ये सब बात तो मैं कर नहीं रहा. हमारा जो बिगर, हम अभी श्रीलंका के एग्जाम्पल को ध्यान में रखते हुए बात कर रहे हैं, राइट? तो दिस इज वन ऑफ द प्राइमरी रीजंस और कंसर्न्स इन दी with India's concerns with OBOR primarily in the context of श्रीलंका. देखिए, आपसे क्वेश्चन जब पूछा जाएगा तो क्वेश्चन एक स्पेसिफिक कंट्री को ध्यान में रखते हुए मैंने बोला ना, स्पेशली इन द लाइट ऑफ श्रीलंका. So if you in the answer you start writing left right everything about OBOR and other countries, then your answer will become very large and unwieldy. तो जब countries यही है कि question largely country specific ही होगा. यूनिवर्सिटी स्टाइल क्वेश्चन देखिए मैं बता रहा हूं, पहले यूपीएससी यूज्ड टू आस्क इन जीएस आल्सो 30 मार्कर 60 मार्कर क्वेश्चंस विच वर लार्जली यूनिवर्सिटी स्टाइल क्वेश्चंस, कि एक क्वेश्चन है और एक पेन है और एक कॉपी और लिख दो. Which was good also and bad also. Good because उसमें पता चल जाता था एक या दो पेज के बाद कहां तक भरोगे, या तो बकवास करोगे या एक्चुअली में आपको जो पता है वही लिख पाओगे. बट द डिसएडवांटेज वाज समथिंग दैट the disadvantage was this कि you could ask lesser number of questions. Now what UPSC has deliberately done is reduced the weightage for each question. That allows it to ask larger number of questions covering broadly almost all areas. तो एक क्वेश्चन एंशिएंट हिस्ट्री का भी आ ही जाएगा, एक मेडिवल से दे ही देंगे, एक आर्ट एंड कल्चर से दे ही देंगे. अब अगर 30 मार्क का क्वेश्चन बनाना है तो बहुत सोचना पड़ेगा, बिकॉज यू हैव फ्यू नंबर ऑफ क्वेश्चंस टू आस्क. तो यूपीएससी has deliberately done this. So keeping this in mind, हमारा भी क्वेश्चन टू द एक्सटेंट होगा स्पेसिफिक. So in the case of Sri Lanka, that is why I give this example. So these are India's concerns with OBOR. Then the next obvious question is, what is the way forward? By India's concern is also this with OBOR. In the case of Sri Lanka is this. I told you it strengthens the hands of what? Authoritarian rulers in Sri Lanka. So will Mr. Rajapaksa feel any sense of urgency to implement the 13th Amendment? 13th Amendment, जिसके बारे में आपने पढ़ा कि give federal structure in Sri Lanka, give provincial government of northern Sri Lanka what autonomy, वो सब करने की इनको जरूरत ही नहीं है. Because who is backing them? China. And the Chinese are not concerned about तुम devolution करो कि नहीं करो. The Chinese have little or no relations of ethnic or cultural to whom? The Sri Lankan Tamils, which is present in case of India. So it is in this context, this is a partly a matter of concern for India. The question is, what is the way forward? देखिए अब वे फॉरवर्ड में हम ब्रॉडली 2 या 3 बातें करते कि इंडिया मस्ट कोलैबोरेट विथ whom? India must collaborate with like-minded partners. And in case of Sri Lanka, India must collaborate with like-minded partners to provide what? Viable developmental alternatives to developing countries like Sri Lanka. To developing countries like whom? Sri Lanka. Meaning, if Indians are saying to the developing countries like Sri Lanka that what? They must not rely or must not have an over dependence on Chinese loans, then to meet their infrastructure developmental needs, they must be offered what? Loans. By whom? By India and other like-minded partners. And India's like-minded partners in the case of Sri Lanka are Japan and USA. Japan and USA, Japan and Sri Lanka have a Buddhism connect. Japan is one of the important donors for Sri Lanka historically, both from Buddhism to education to elsewhere. Japan is also thus important. USA is one of the biggest markets for Sri Lankan exports. almost 17 to 20% of Sri Lankan exports go to USA. Okay. Similarly, Japan is the number one developmental partner of Sri Lanka. And obviously, India is the biggest trading partner of Sri Lanka, closely along with China. But India also provides the maximum number of tourists to Sri Lanka, and their economy is partly dependent on that. India obviously also is one of the important destination for shipping. What? Almost 60% of the container traffic Sri Lanka का major economy चलता 3-4 चीजों से. One is from tea and garment exports. Second is from tourism. The third is from the revenue that they get from coastal shipping. Most of the ships that come to the Colombo port in Sri Lanka are ultimately directed towards India. Colombo is a deep water port. Matlab a port which can have deep ships or big ships. Which can obviously harbor deep ships, basically because these are deep water ports. Most of India's west coast ports are not deep water ports. Okay, and वो ports इतने बड़े हैं नहीं that they can have, except the Kandla port which has been developed. There is no other port on the western side which can have mega ships coming in. So what normally happens is, I don't know whether you're aware of this or not, that most of the ships, big ships which have to come to India, they first go to Sri Lanka. From there they are offloaded into small ships, and from there they go into other ports in India. Colombo is a natural deep water port. Okay, and that's why it's an important source of earnings for whom? Sri Lanka. So the Colombo port is extremely important for Sri Lanka as an economic lifeline, apart from tourism and tea, etc., and textiles. So India is important, Japan is important, US is important. We all have a concern with the rise of China. So we can work together. Right? The classic example of India and Japan trying to work together was to get the ownership or was to get the operational control of the Eastern Container Terminal in Sri Lanka. In Colombo, the Eastern Container Terminal we wanted to develop jointly together along with Japan. However, that did not materialize. So, but still in 2019, India and Japan had proposed the idea of jointly developing what? The Eastern Container Terminal. देखिए ये Eastern Container Terminal of the Colombo port. But this did not materialize. Why? Because there was a strong opposition to this by partly the trade unions in Sri Lanka, which may have been largely fueled by the Chinese. Okay, because the Chinese were already developing the Colombo port. India developing the eastern wing of this Colombo port did not go down well with whom? Chinese. ये आपने पढ़ा है कि नहीं पढ़ा है ना? So this did not go. The Chinese were already developing the Colombo port. Further, the Indians said that if the Chinese are getting into the Colombo port, it's a matter of concern for India, because all the traffic from Colombo is coming anyways to where? India. What if tomorrow the Chinese block the Colombo port access to India? So India said that is unacceptable. We will also, you give us also a stake for development of the Colombo port. So the eastern wing of the Colombo port, initially India and Japan were to jointly develop. But the Chinese and the local politicians, obviously, along with that, there was a strong protest and this project was shelved. And who was executing the project on the Indian side? Right? Bade bhai. Right? So the Adanis were executing the project from the Indian side, were supposed to execute. The project did not go through. India and Japan were not happy with this, and eventually what happened in 2020? COVID struck. And then COVID meant a lot of bad news for Sri Lanka. Why? Because the Sri Lankan economy simply collapsed after this, because it is dependent on tourism, which collapsed. Also, container traffic decreased. Also, apart from this, you see that whether it is on tourism or container traffic, and it had high debt obligations, not just to China but overall to the Western world also. External debt, high external debt obligations. So the Sri Lankan economy collapsed, and Sri Lanka was staring at what you call as a balance of payment crisis. So much so that Sri Lanka did not have enough foreign reserves left to import food grains also, and to import oil, fuel, etc. also. It is at this time that they asked the Chinese for what? Repayment or restructuring their debts of $1.5 billion. The Chinese agreed to a currency swap and restructuring of debt, delaying the repayments of loans to China, and China agreed to this to the tune of $1.5 billion. When? After the first wave, China agreed to a debt swap, a debt repayment and a currency swap of something to the tune of $1.5 billion US dollars. Then it is at this time that the Sri Lankans now turn towards whom? India. India also resorted to a number of things. Firstly, India resorted to our vaccine diplomacy. Okay. India resorted to vaccine diplomacy after the first wave. We are like, हमने बना लिया वैक्सीन, लो तुम ले लो, हमारे यहाँ तो वैसे भी कोविड आएगा नहीं. So India did a lot of vaccine diplomacy, and India was the first country to provide vaccines to whom? Sri Lanka. We are focusing on Sri Lanka, so India did that. Apart from this, they also requested India for what? A $1 billion again currency swap and all that. Indian said, दे देंगे currency swap, अभी रुको. पहले you need to what? You have to give us a counter offer for revoking the Eastern Container Terminal deal. So the Sri Lankans went ahead, and you see that the Western Container Terminal, the same Colombo port, developing the Western Terminal project was offered to India. This took another year and a half. देखिए second wave भी आ गया, चला गया, and the third wave by December 21. That is by अभी जो December गया, India said we will give you that $1 billion currency swap, and India said a 4-point action plan for revival of Sri Lankan economy we will support. But the Western Container Terminal you give, and the Trichonamali port you give. These are India's responses to whom? China. So Sri Lanka for long has tried to play the China card, and South Asian countries have willingly looked to play the China card partly against India, saying that India must up its game. India must not believe that India's neighbors have no option, and the option is China. But some of these countries have landed themselves in a debt trap vis-a-vis China. While playing the China card against India, they went a bit further. And in that process, they are now again looking back at India. And in case of Sri Lanka, recognizing Sri Lanka's importance, India has shown the proactiveness in terms of what? Making the moves, whether it came on the Western Container Terminal in Colombo or the Trichonamally port, which is a major oil refinery come storage come export unit in the northern part of Sri Lanka. The Trichonamally port is a 900-acre project which has some 100 storage units. India has the majority, India and the Indian Oil, the Lankan division of the Indian Oil Company, or is the majority shareholder in the Trichonamally port for the next 50 years. Okay, which means that India is going to have a major say in how Sri Lanka gets its oil. Sri Lanka, like India, उनका खुद का तो oil है नहीं. It is dependent on imports. Importing oil is one thing. So that whole, once the oil is imported, it has to be kept in reserves. Okay, stored. And from there it has to be transported in the whole city. Or sorry, in the whole state. So in Sri Lanka, the biggest storehouse will be Trichonamally. It is already, there are some 14 units there which are already active, which are under Indian control. Practically, India will decide how Sri Lanka gets its fuel. You mess with us, you are not getting your fuel. If you are not getting your fuel, your economy will collapse. That is why the Trichonamally is such an important thing in the game. India has already done this in the past with Bhutan, as we'll see. In the case of Bhutan, as I'll tell you, 2013, 2 weeks before Bhutan's elections, India stopped oil supply to Bhutan. Oil prices rocketed, government fell. ठीक, वो तो ट्रेलर था, ये पिक्चर है. ठीक है. So basically, geography offers us that advantage, and the Indian policy makers have used that in the past. The Sri Lankans are wary of Indian state's presence, but they played their hand too far against the Chinese. On top of that came the pandemic and its complexities, and they had nowhere else to look apart from India. China से तो वो ले चुके हैं, उनको जो जो देना है, हम्बन टोटा दे दिया, कोलंबो दे दिया, क्या क्या दोगे? And you can't over rely on the Chinese also. So you don't want to put all your eggs either in the Indian basket nor in the Chinese basket. And the Indians have shown the willingness to go ahead and do what? Build the Trichonamally port and the storage infrastructure there, and also build the Western Container Terminal, and ensure that China doesn't what? China doesn't convert Sri Lanka into a complete client state like China has done in the case of Pakistan. ठीक है, तो वो पाकिस्तान वालों को देखिए कितना फायदा हो सकता है अगर वो हमसे ले ले लोन. लेते ही नहीं है वो. मैं बोल रहा हूं, बिक जाएंगे, लुट जाएंगे, खत्म हो जाएंगे, लेकिन इंडिया से नहीं लेंगे. Right? It is not a joke. India can practically supply fuel, electricity, everything to Pakistan. India can make profits. The Pakistani people can get over their fuel shortages, to prices, to many other problems. But then, फिर next election में किस मुद्दे पे होगी बात, है ना? तो this is, so there is, so the India Sri Lanka example is a good example of what some positive things India has managed to do in case of countering the Chinese presence. The Western Container Terminal as well as the Trichonamally port. So आप ये पता था आपको ब्रॉड, तो आप लिख लीजिए. Just you can write this down. India must collaborate with like-minded partners to provide a viable developmental alternatives to developing countries like Sri Lanka. For example, between 2020 to 2022, the Indian response to the COVID, Indian response to The increasing Chinese presence in Sri Lanka has been guided by securing a long term in Sri Lanka has been guided by securing long-term strategic presence India's response to the increasing Chinese presence in Sri Lanka has been guided by the objective, has been guided by the objective of securing a long-term strategic presence in the island country. For example, Indian companies like Adani Ports has secured 51% stake in the Western Container Terminal of Colombo Port of Colombo Port. It is going to safeguard India's strategic objectives as it is going to safeguard India's strategic objectives as 60% of Colombo's container traffic, 60% of Colombo's container traffic is directed towards India. It is going to safeguard India's strategic objectives as 60% of Colombo's container traffic is directed where? Towards India. Further, given the Chinese presence in Sri Lanka, given the Chinese presence in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, given the Chinese presence in the Colombo port, the operational control of the Western Terminal or Western Container Terminal will give India will give India a strategic window to keep a close watch on Chinese activities in the region. Okay. Next, Chinese activities in the region. 51% stake. There is a $700 million project. बहुत ज्यादा फैक्ट्स नहीं याद रखने होते हैं, बड़े बेसिक फैक्ट. You know, Indian companies like Adani Ports have secured 51% stake in the $700 million Western Container Terminal project to the Colombo port. So that's it. That's one part of the way forward. The other is that further, as a part of ये सब recent developments भी हैं, you know, क्योंकि देखिए आप लोग रोज रोज पढ़ते रहते हैं, साल में एक बार पढ़ना होता है. मैं तो ऊपर से हेडिंग पढ़ता हूं बस, और फिर साल में एक बार आई ओपन गूगल, टाइप इंडिया, श्रीलंका, द हिंदू, इंडियन एक्सप्रेस, सारे आर्टिकल निकाल लेता हूं एक बार में पढ़ लेता हूं. रोज रोज पल पल की खबर आज तक करने की जरूरत नहीं है. ठीक है, ब्रॉड कहानी हमें पता है, ऐसा तो है नहीं कोई नया टर्मिनल बन के एक साल में ही खड़ा हो जाएगा. राइट, तो जो मैं आज आपको पढ़ा रहा हूं, अब ये आपके अगले 2-3 साल तक नहीं बदलने वाला है. इसमें कुछ ऐसे थोड़ी ना हो जाता है कि कल के बाद एक नई डील आज हो गई और परसों मटीरियलाइज होगी. दिस हैज बीन इन डिस्कशन फॉर इयर्स. अब 2-4 साल कुछ नहीं होने वाला है इसके आगे इसमें. ठीक है, सो वी ऑफन थिंक दैट IR changes very frequently. It doesn't. What happens frequently are meetings and events. But meetings and events do not always lead necessarily to substantial changes. अभी Indian foreign minister went there to meet him, that minister came here to meet. क्या करें हम? Change तो यही होना है ना इन्हीं चीजों पे. So this is the thing to watch out for. Further, the Indian side has secured a major stake in the development of what? The Trichonamali port as a part of a 4-point package deal offered by India for reviving the Sri Lankan economy. देखिए, the Sri Lankan rupee to the dollar is trending at something around is at something around 200 rupees, 200 Sri Lankan rupees to a dollar. Okay, Indian is at 75-76. अब सोचिए, दिमाग ऐसे लगाते हैं लोग जिनके पास बहुत पैसा होता है. That if I am sitting in India, I buy a lot of dollars. Using that dollars, I buy a lot of not rupee assets in Sri Lanka. रुपी की तो कोई वैल्यू रहेगी नहीं उनके, बट जमीन की तो रहेगी. ओके, तो आप इंडिया में घर खरीदना अगर मुश्किल हो रहा है तो आप श्रीलंका में अभी खरीद सकते हैं. वहां वो अलाउ भी कर रहे हैं, खरीद लो. मैं जब लास्ट टाइम मैंने वेंट टू श्रीलंका, आई वाज लाइक, नहीं आपको बता रहा हूं, आप गोवा में घर बहुत महंगा है, श्रीलंका में खरीद सकते हैं. बीच उनके भी अच्छे. ठीक है, cheaper. Sri Lanka is cheaper than Kerala. Sri Lanka is cheaper than Goa. जो एरिया के वहां पे डिसेंट प्लेस टू स्टे ऑल्सो. थोड़ा बहुत सीखना पड़ेगा, लैंग्वेज सीख लीजिए, इतना क्या है जब सस्ते में घर मिल रहा है. और हाँ, अपनी वाली फीलिंग. अरे कैसे अखंड भारत में आप बोल रहे हैं अपनी वाली फीलिंग. सो ऑफर्ड बाय इंडिया फॉर रिवाइविंग द श्रीलंकन इकोनॉमी. और इस 4 पॉइंट डील में व्हाट इंडिया इज ऑफर्ड में जो मेजर चीज है आर 2 पॉइंट्स दैट यू शुड नो. दैट a $1 billion as a part of this 4-point package deal. A major thing was the $1 billion credit swap facility. India has been provided to Sri Lanka, which will help Sri Lanka meet its external debt obligations, which will aid Sri Lanka to meet their external debt obligations. And also the 850-acre Trikonamali port and storage development project, in which the Indian Oil Company IOC is developing 14 containers. India, and they are owned by India. 14 containers which are owned by India. This pen is not working properly. 14 containers, oil storage containers, which are owned by India. Some 24 are owned by CPC, which is Ceylon Petroleum Company, आपने बोला Chinese, which is a Sri Lankan company, government owned company. They have built some 24 containers, or they will, in the future build some 24 containers. And also there will be another 60 new containers which will be built jointly by whom? 60 new containers which will be built jointly by CPC and IOC. This will practically be providing all the oil of Sri Lanka. Okay, so that is why it is so important, and India having an operational control in the project means that India's good relations with India are vital for the energy security of Sri Lanka. ठीक है, तो that is there. So a major say in the Trikonamali port ensures India has a strategic presence in Sri Lanka over the next 50 to 100 years. Okay, so that's the context, and this is what India has been doing, and India needs to show this, or these are some of the positive steps which India has been taking in case of Sri Lanka, which has allowed it to recover some lost ground. क्योंकि ground was lost between 2010 to 20. 2010 से 20 के बीच में there was a lot of ground lost because there's the Hambantota port, the Matala airport, the Colombo project, and all these projects. And the Chinese presence, I remember I went to Sri Lanka in 2017-18, and I went to one casino and full of Chinese people, okay, in Colombo. Okay, so the Chinese presence is here to stay in Sri Lanka. India is not going to take the Chinese out of Sri Lanka. But at the same point of time, given their proximity to India, given their geographical proximity, the cultural, the linguistic aspects also, and also the fact that India is a major destination for Sri Lankan exports. India is also the biggest supplier of tourism for Sri Lanka. India has all the advantages, but India needed to what? Get involved in Sri Lankan infrastructure projects, which it has finally managed to do, partly helped by the pandemic. Okay, the pandemic has forced Sri Lanka's hands that it has no option but re-engage India. So it has partly helped India, and India has recovered some of the lost ground. Last point जो आपको लिखना है आंसर में कभी भी as a way forward in India-Sri-Lanka relations, that India must continue to press for a full implementation of the 13th Amendment. क्योंकि we are not there just for the oil or the shipping. Sri Lanka's Tamil diaspora has strong linkages to India. So while the Chinese need not press for the implementation of the 13th Amendment, we will always have to do so, given the strong cultural and ethnic links between Sri Lankan Tamils and Indian Tamils. Done. Clear? Any doubts you have till here? Very good, no doubts. We in India, anyways, don't ask questions in Parliament also, outside Parliament also. Definitely not in schools or colleges. Often say, Indians demand more accountability from Swiggy and their delivery guys. Why are you late? But nobody has problem with Vikas being a few years late. Chaliye. In terms of East Asia, not in East Asia. No, not in East Asia. So this is what I wanted to discuss with you in Sri Lanka. तो आपने जो पहले पढ़ रखा था, and apart from this is more than enough in Sri Lanka. ठीक है. The next thing I'll discuss with you is, say, let's have which is a discussion on West Asia. You have no. East Asia तो बता दिया मैंने सब, और क्या बताना है? वो आपको मिला नहीं है handout. But West Asia is something that I wanted to have some discussion, which is largely a map-based discussion. Uska handout, you'll get it in the next class. Just one second. Yes. So देखिए, West Asia एक important area है in the sense कि just so when we talk about West Asia, just one second, let me download. Okay, so when we talk about West Asia, the important thing about West Asia, firstly, is to keep in mind कि ये मैं आपको जो मैप बेस बता रहा हूँ, वेस्ट एशिया से काफी क्वेश्चंस आए हैं पहले भी, और अभी तो जो भी चल रहा है ये क्या इन द लाइट ऑफ क्रिमिया एंड ऑल, तो वेस्ट एशिया से मैप बेस्ड क्वेश्चन कैन कम डायरेक्टली इन द प्रीलिम्स एग्जामिनेशन आल्सो. ठीक है, तो आपको एक चीज बता दूं जो आपको इंपॉर्टेंट एरियाज फोकस करने हैं, स्पेशली फ्रॉम द मैप बेस्ड अंडरस्टैंडिंग ऑफ वेस्ट एशिया टू बिगिन विद. फर्स्टली देखिए जब आप वेस्ट एशिया का मैप देखते हैं तो आपको फोकस जो रखना है वो कुछ कंट्रीज पे रखना है. ऑब्वियसली इजराइल एंड द सराउंडिंग ज्योग्राफी ऑफ इजराइल यू मस्ट बी वेल अवेयर ऑफ. टर्की, it's a major power of West Asia, and Turkey surrounds the Mediterranean Sea also, it surrounds the Black Sea also, and it also thus is a very important power. अभी भी आपने अगर सुना हो तो a lot of those negotiations are happening where between the Russians and the Ukrainians. कहाँ हो रहा है? Turkey, right? So Turkey is a very important neighbor in this region also, so you should know about that also. Needless to say, Iran and Saudi Arabia, और इनका जो मैप है अराउंड द हॉर्न ऑफ अफ्रीका. नॉर्मली दिस इज कॉल्ड एज द वाना रीजन, द वेस्ट एशिया नॉर्थ अफ्रीका रीजन, वाना. ओके, तो दैट्स आई वुड से अगर आप इन तीन पे भी फोकस रखते हैं इट विल हेल्प यू. Israel and its neighbors, Turkey and its neighbors, Iran, Saudi Arabia and its neighbors. इसका भी अगर if you get a map based understanding, that's kind of enough. So yeah, so if we look at this okay, so when we look at this West Asia region, India formally announced a Look West policy when in 2005. And India's West Asia policy has two very important pillars which is not there in East Asia. One is energy security. And the second, at a very big scale, is the Indian diaspora. Okay, that there is a large amount of Indian diaspora which is working in West Asia. And in West Asia, whether that is in Saudi Arabia, Oman, Bahrain, and was also partly to a certain extent in Yemen. So there is a large Indian diaspora which is working in Saudi Arabia, Dubai, Oman, Bahrain, these four countries definitely, and in some other countries as well. So there is India's diaspora whose needs and interests have to be safeguarded, and India's West Asia policy is always keeping this in mind. That if there is any large war in West Asia, तो आप देख ही रहे अभी तो क्या समझाना, यूक्रेन में तो इतने से लोग हैं. In Ukraine, the Indian diaspora is a very small diaspora over students, etc. Right? But in the case of West Asia, they're literally into millions. Okay, so if Saudi Arabia and Iran go to a full war with each other, evacuating Indians from Saudi Arabia is going to be a nightmare of an exercise. You will still require 10 Akshay Kumars to do it. The last time Akshay Kumar did it was airlift, right? It will require God knows how many airlifts. India did the, for example, in case of Yemen, in the recent Yemen conflict, or in the 1990-1991, the Gulf War between Iraq and Iran, and in which Kuwait was involved. When Saddam Hussein was the Iraqi Prime Minister, India had to evacuate a large number of Indian citizens from Iraq, which was a largely successful mission in which more than 2 to 3 lakh Indian citizens were evacuated from Iraq back then. Okay, so but that's only still in lakhs, but in case of Saudi Arabia, it's practically running into more than 1 million. Okay, so it's just going to be a nightmare of an exercise. If Saudi Arabia and Iran go to war, firstly the oil prices will hike, वो तो ठीक है. उसके अलावा you have to evacuate your civilians. Also these people will lose their employment. So as much as we would want oil, चलिए छोड़िए, इसके आगे नहीं बोलता हूं मैं, रोक लिया मैंने. आप तो चले जाएंगे फिर 1 साल बाद, चलिए छोड़. तो So basically, the long and short of the story is this, that West Asia, the Indian diaspora's interests have to be safeguarded, and that is a extremely important concern which is there in India's Look West policy, which is not that big a concern as far as Look East is concerned, primarily because of the fact that West Asia is a way more volatile region, primarily because of the Saudi and the Iran rivalry in the region. Now, if you look, for example, this map, ये तो आपको पता ही होगा, ये मैप अपने वैसे भी देखा होगा, राइट? दिस इज सऊदी अरेबिया, दिस इज Iran. Between them is which Gulf? The Persian Gulf. This is the Persian Gulf. This Persian Gulf is from where are Saudi Arabia's most of the oil reserves located? On its eastern side or western side? Where are Iran's most of the oil reserves located? So they start bombing out each other's oil fields. हो गया, ठीक है, आपस में तो लड़े, but it will have huge impact for other economies, right? These two countries put together, और यहीं से सारा ऑयल किसका भी जाता है? Where is Iraq's oil going to come out from? यहीं से सारा ऑयल यहीं से आना है. Almost 35 to 40% of the world's oil is going to come from the narrow Persian Gulf region, where there are two strong rivals, Saudi Arabia and Iran, and Iraq is also there. If they get embroiled in a larger war or conflict with each other, the oil prices will skyrocket, and thus what? It is in the interest of all major economies to ensure that they don't go to war with each other, except whom? The Americans now. Americans no longer import oil from West Asia. हो गया उनका खत्म. America is an oil surplus economy. They are producing shale gas and oil enough to meet their own needs, and they can now export it elsewhere. So they are telling to whom? The Germans. They are telling to the French, you need oil, we will give you. Don't buy it from Russia. But the Russian oil is cheaper. More importantly, buying oil from Russia also safeguards a certain amount of peace for Russia and Germany with, safeguards a certain amount of peace for Germany and France with Russia. Okay. So that's there. So they would want to continue buying oil from Russia, and then Russia would want to continue exporting oil to Germany and other countries in the region. And so similarly here, who would want peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran? India. All other players would want, but not so keen anymore would be whom? So not so keen would be the United States. Okay. United States, till it had what? Major oil dependence partly from this region, it had also a long-term interest of securing a certain amount of peace in the region, but it no longer has that kind of willingness or intent. एक तो ये क्यों? क्योंकि it has now become partly oil surplus. But that's one thing. US is already has already pulled out of Afghanistan. USA doesn't want to be involved in the Syrian conflict. It has already pulled out of Iraq. USA doesn't want to be involved in West Asia any longer because it wants to be primarily involved in Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific, where it wants to focus on dealing with China. USA wants to concentrate its energies on dealing with China. Is that good news for India? India wants to concentrate also on China. They also want to concentrate on China. You may say it's a good news for India. But partly what is to be understood, and Shyam Saran and many others have said, that while India and US today have a convergence of interest east of India, that convergence is not visible west of India. So it cannot be कि हाँ ईस्ट में तो हम दोस्त हैं और वेस्ट में तुम अपना देख लो और हम अपना देख लें. So many people are like, अरे सर, India and US are natural allies. They are not natural allies. India wants good relations with Iran. USA doesn't want good relations with Iran. India wants good relations with Iran because we will get access through yahan with Afghanistan, and we will get oil from Iran, which is also cheap. But USA doesn't see Iran in the same light as India does. So from India's look west policy and energy security point of view, having good relations with Iran is a priority. But that is not the case for US. तो ऐसे कैसे कि यहां दोस्त और फिर वहां नहीं. So this is why we say there are many challenges in India-US relationship as well. And one of the challenges is that while we have a certain degree of meeting of minds on dealing with the Chinese, that is missing. For example, as far as India's look west policy goes. Okay. So Iran is one major obstacle in the convergence between India's and American interests as far as India's west sphere goes. चलिए, ये तो एक ब्रॉड चीज है जो आपको पता होना चाहिए. तो ये जो पर्शियन गल्फ है, ये सारा आपको कंट्री पता होना चाहिए. कुवैत है ना, बहरीन आइलैंड कंट्री, कतर, एंड ये यूएई, राइट. सो नाउ if you look, almost 35 to 40% of the world's oil passes through this region, through the Persian Gulf, and from there it goes here also, and in the Indian Ocean region to India and China also. So these are the two important choke points. Any navy which has a strong presence along these two choke points can practically control the flow of oil. So at this choke point there is this small country of Djibouti. Okay. So here, for example, if I was to show you the other map, just one second. देखिए, बड़ा बेसिक है ना, ये तो आप समझ गए थे कि ये है क्या, येमेन. This is Yemen, and a zoomed in map here will show Djibouti. Now Djibouti is such an important one because it is located so close to the Bab-e-Mandab Strait. The Bab-e-Mandab Strait, which connects whom and whom? The Bab-e-Mandab Strait, which connects the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. This is that narrowest point, and this is located close to Djibouti. Okay, this is located close to Djibouti, and in Djibouti there is the overseas naval base of Japan, China, USA, France. Practically most of the revenue of their economy comes by just giving overseas naval bases to many of these countries. All of them have stationed their navy and military in this region because practically they can control the flow of trade as well as oil if they control this strait. Okay. So that is why for Djibouti, its location is its price. Okay. And which basically drives its economy. Now that is for the Bab e Mandab Strait. And similarly, here you have what? The Strait of Hormuz, connecting the Gulf of Oman and the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz. तो ये जो स्ट्रेट ऑफ हॉर्मुज है, आई टोल्ड यू, ये सीधे सीधे पूछा जाता है, स्ट्रेट ऑफ हॉर्मुज कनेक्ट्स हुम एंड हुम, द बाब ए मंदब कनेक्ट्स हुम एंड हुम. ओके, तो ये आपको पता होना चाहिए. सेकेंडली, क्लोज टू द स्ट्रेट ऑफ हॉर्मुज इज द बंदर अब्बास एज वेल एज द विच पोर्ट जो इंडिया वाज सपोज टू डेवलप, चबहार, है ना. So by maintaining our navy or having a possible naval presence at Chabahar, India wanted to maintain proximity of its naval forces to the Strait of Hormuz, which was partly in response to the Chinese having presence in Gwadar. Also, because the Chinese have the naval presence where in Djibouti, so India also wants to have a naval presence, and it has secured in Oman the Dockam port. Indian Navy has secured berthing rights in Oman, where the port that India has secured access to after 2018 is the Dockam port. So you see that between the navies of India and China, there is partly a contest. Okay, that both want to expand their naval presence in the region, and both have their own reasons as well. So that is happening on the West Asia side. In the East Asia side, in Malacca also, along Malacca we have the Andaman and Nicobar, but there also in Indonesia, India has sought the access of the Sabang port. Sabang, S-A-B-A-N-G, Sabang port. Where? In Indonesia. ठीक है. So this is firstly about the geography of this region, जो आपको बड़ा बेसिक है तो आपको पता ही होना चाहिए. Now coming where to, if I was to say, चलिए अब जो नेक्स्ट मेजर जो आजकल चल रहा है एकदम न्यूज में, द ब्लैक सी एंड द मेडिटेरेनियन सी, विच आर लोकेटेड वेयर? टर्की. देखिए 3 सी है, मेडिटेरेनियन सी, ब्लैक सी, और ये क्या है? कैस्पियन सी. ये सेंट्रल एशिया में also it's seen, but this is the Caspian Sea, this is the Black Sea. Okay, ये क्या है? Russia has access to the Black Sea also, as the Caspian Sea also. The Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, are they connected to each other? Yes, they are connected to each other. In fact, which is one country which is considered to be situated mostly in Asia and partly in Europe? हाँ, वो यूरेशिया में हम कहते हैं कि which Russia is a Eurasian country, it's said, but in the context apart from Russia, if you were to say one country, it is Turkey. The Turkey is a country which is located mostly where? In Asia, but only a small part of it is in Europe. तो पहले टर्की वॉज अ पार्ट ऑफ द ऑटोमन एम्पायर, टर्की के अंदर होता था कॉन्स्टेंटिनोपल, टर्की वॉज कंसिडर्ड एज द ब्रिज बिटवीन एशिया एंड यूरोप. सो वेयर इज दिस ब्रिज? This bridge is connecting across what we call as the Bosphorus Strait. ये रहा, ये इसका zoomed in मैप है. ये वही टर्की है, ये इसका यूरोपियन पार्ट है. This is the European part of Turkey. Okay. Now, connecting the Turkey's Asian and European part is which landmass? Is the Bosphorus Strait, which is a narrow point. The Bosphorus Strait connects the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, and in between the two is the Sea of Marmara, which is connected to the Black Sea through the narrow choke point of the Bosphorus Strait, and which is the Sea of Marmara opens into the Mediterranean Sea through the Dardanelles Strait. ये प्रीलिमिनरी सीधा सीधा पूछा जा सकता है, और आपको लग रहा है कि सर ये तो ज्योग्राफी का पार्ट है. ये ज्योग्राफी का पार्ट नहीं है, ये आईआर का पार्ट है. Why? Because in the Black Sea is stationed which navy? The Russian Navy. Okay. In the Black Sea, the Russian Navy is stationed. The Russian Navy is stationed in the Baltic Sea also. ऊपर, ठीक है, उधर Baltic में ऊपर, Northern Europe में. But the problem with the Baltic Sea fleet of the Russian Navy is it is frozen during winter. सर्दी में वहां सब जम जाता है, शिप भी जम जाती है, कोई कहीं नहीं जा रहा है. ठीक है. That is on the western side of Russia in the north. On the eastern side of Russia also in the north, everything is frozen. No ship is going anywhere. And the Russian Navy thus practically becomes frozen during winters. The only warm water port of Russia, which is open throughout the year, is the Russian ports in the Black Sea region. ये आपने पढ़ा होगा, राइट? नहीं भी पढ़ा है तो कोई बात नहीं, अभी किसी ने नहीं पढ़ा होगा तो मैं पढ़ा, न्यूज़पेपर में पढ़ा हो, नहीं पढ़ा तो हम बता. So basically it is where in this Black Sea the Russian Navy is stationed and it's a warm water port. In fact a good part of where, ये थोड़ा सा समझने में मुश्किल होगा अगर आपको मैप नहीं पता है तो, a good part of Russian Navy comes from the Baltic Sea into the Black Sea during winters. मतलब वो कहां से आते हैं? Basically what happens is, I don't have that, if I was to draw a poor map on my own, if this is the European landmass, this is the Russian landmass. यहां पे there is Norway, Sweden, etc., Finland, जो भी है. And here is the Baltic Sea. Then the Russian Navy comes from the Baltic Sea. ये क्या है? North Africa. Here is your Mediterranean Sea. So the Russian Navy comes from the Baltic Sea into the Mediterranean Sea, and from the Mediterranean Sea goes into the Black Sea. Sitting across them is what? Your Turkey. So Turkey sits across what? The entry and exit routes of Russian Navy into the Baltic Sea. Turkey a NATO ally. Turkey is a NATO ally. But Turkey is a NATO ally. ठीक है. Is Turkey in Europe? Yes, थोड़ा सा. But predominantly it is in Asia. So for Russia, the fact that Turkey is a NATO ally is never a good news. Because for their navy's entry and exit routes, especially during winters, there is already a NATO ally sitting at its entry and exit routes. So Turkey doesn't like this. Russia doesn't like this. Now, over the time that the Turkish President Erdogan has sought to cultivate good relations with Russia also in the recent past. Okay, वो एक अलग कहानी है. But you see, Turkey's location makes it what? A very important power in the region, also because of its controlling influence over what? The Dardanelles Strait and the Bosphorus Strait. Right? Because the Russian Navy is where? The Russian Navy is here. And that Russian Navy needs to go through the Bosphorus Strait, through the Dardanelles Strait, and only then it can enter the Mediterranean Sea. What is this? Crimean Peninsula. Crimea, in Crimean Peninsula, even before 2014, even before Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, then also the Russian Navy was stationed. Russia, even before it annexed Crimea in 2014, the Russian Navy was stationed in Crimea. Now, in 2014, they annexed Crimea completely. Why they could not live without Crimea is because if they don't control Crimea, their navy in the region will never be safe. Especially in the backdrop of even a NATO ally like Turkey. Okay. So that's another context. The Russians have never left Crimea. Never in the past 200 years. Okay. So Ukraine or no Ukraine, Russia has always maintained a stronghold over Crimea. Okay. So that's it. अब यहां पे अगर कुछ और पूछ सकते हैं वो तो थोड़ा सा और अगर इसकी एक लेवल और डेप्थ में जाके अगर पूछ लिया, अब पूछ सकते हैं क्योंकि अब तो लड़ रहे हैं वो. ये ब्लैक सी, राइट, दिस इज क्रिमिया, द सी ऑफ अजोव. आपने न्यूज़पेपर में हो सकता है कहीं पढ़ा हो, Mariupol, that Russians have given a safe corridor in Mariupol. है ना? कहां है Mariupol? यहां. Because the Russian Navy wants to even have a control over this region, so that even in the Sea of Azov, the Russian Navy is not challenged by Ukraine or any other party. And practically Black Sea becomes a Russian sea. Is ultimate game of Russia to strengthen its naval presence and to have a functional navy all round the year, which is not choked by a NATO ally and which is not frozen during winters. That's broadly the idea. Obviously, to a certain extent, I have simplified things. एक चीज और, I'll come to you. One more thing that you can look into और जो prelims में आ सकता है is which of the countries in the region does not share a border with the Black Sea. देखिए, in the sense that if you look at Ukraine, obviously Ukraine has a border. Romania, it has a border. Turkey has a border. Russia has a border. ठीक है. What about Greece? Yes, Georgia has a, वो अभी उधर पे आएंगे, ईस्टर्न साइड पे जॉर्जिया. But does Greece have a border? No, Greece doesn't have a border. Yes, if you go to the Black Sea on the eastern side, Georgia has a border. Does Armenia have a border? No. Armenia का उधर है कैस्पियन सी में. ठीक है. तो that is one thing that you need to know. Bulgaria, ये वो सब है जो आपको पता होना चाहिए. बुल्गारिया, रोमानिया, यूक्रेन, रशिया, जॉर्जिया, टर्की. रटना नहीं है, मैप देखते रहना है. यू सी इट 10 times, you will not forget. Okay, I'm telling you, in fact, you take a piece of paper, draw your own map और अपने आप भर लीजिए, और जो ना याद आए उसको देख लीजिए एंड क्रॉस चेक इट विद ओरिजिनल मैप. बेस्ट वे टू रिमेंबर. दे आस्क यू डायरेक्टली, क्वेश्चन पूछा गया है पहले रशिया के बारे में. विच ऑफ द कंट्रीज शेयर द बॉर्डर विथ द ब्लैक सी एंड द कैस्पियन सी? विच ऑफ द कंट्री शेयर द बॉर्डर विथ द मेडिटेरेनियन सी एंड द ब्लैक सी? टर्की. Turkey is one of those countries which shares the border with both the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Right? तो ये कुछ बेसिक स्टफ है जो आपको पता होना चाहिए. Why do we say partly that it is Russia's geopolitical necessity to have a control over Crimea is because of its naval or maritime interests. अब रशिया ने बोला उतना नहीं हमारा जियोपॉलिटिकल नेसेसिटी, हमको तो पूरा कोस्टलाइन ऑफ यूक्रेन ही चाहिए. वी विल मेक यूक्रेन लैंडलॉक्ड, यूक्रेन विल बिकम डिपेंडेंट ऑन अस, so it can never think of becoming a what NATO ally. ठीक है, तो वो बहुत सारी चीजें जो भी उनकी ग्रैंड स्ट्रैटेजी मेरे को नहीं पता. पुतिन साहब नोज बेस्ट. ठीक है, तो ना हमसे कोई पूछेगा. ओके, व्हाट डू यू थिंक शुड बी द वे फॉरवर्ड फॉर रशिया टू डील विद यूक्रेन? हमारा काम नहीं है, हमें बस इतना पता होना चाहिए व्हाट इज हैपनिंग, व्हाई इट इज हैपनिंग इन दिस एरिया. ये जो इंपॉर्टेंट स्ट्रेट्स एंड रूट्स हैं, दिस इज व्हाट वी शुड नो. यस,
so even if you get Ukraine force, how does it affect it a lot?
देखिए, व्हाट यू आर आस्किंग इज कि सर रशिया इज ऑलरेडी हैज द क्रिमियन पेनिनसुला रीजन, व्हाई डज इट वांट टू फर्दर एक्सपैंड इट्स कंट्रोल ऑन द कोस्ट लाइन ऑफ यूक्रेन? हाँ, विथ रिस्पेक्ट टू इट्स नेवीज इंटरेस्ट. देखिए, एकदम विथ रिस्पेक्ट टू इट्स नेवीज इंटरेस्ट, इट इज एज मच एज दिस दैट इट्स नॉट so it's as much as this that what Russia wants apparently to do, it anyways has control over Crimea, but going beyond it, it also wants to ensure that this whole of the eastern coast, and even if possible go all the way and take over the western coast of Ukraine also, if possible. Broadly, the reasoning is this, that it may force Ukraine to, or it will cut off Ukraine's access to sea, converting it into a landlocked. Ukraine is anyways dependent on वो आपने oil, Russian oil transit and all that, but reducing their access to sea, giving leverage to whom? Russians. Okay, तो अब बाकी मुझे नहीं पता, बाकी I also don't know. ठीक है, please also understand it is often argued that a lot of areas which Russia is capturing or may capture, eventually Russia may give up them, but that it will do in the negotiating stage. देखिए, बड़ा सिंपल होता है, हमेशा ऐसा होता है, आप वॉर में ज्यादा टेरिटरी कैप्चर करते हैं, then you go to the negotiating table and say I am giving up this. In return, what are you giving up? So if Russia wants the Donetsk and the Luhansk region, apparently if that is the case, the Russians are interested यहाँ से भी हर जगह से आके, and then they'll say occupy Kyiv, and if they occupy Kyiv, they'll be like, let's sit on the negotiating table, we'll leave Kyiv, we'll leave the eastern side, the northern side, we'll keep the ईस्टर्न साइड और रिकॉग्नाइज देम एज रिपब्लिक, ये वो जो भी बोलना है. ठीक, दिस इज वी आर रेडी टू कम टू अ नेगोशिएशन में हमेशा गिव एंड टेक इज गोइंग टू हैपन. सो द पुतिन विल देन से, लुक, आई एम ऑल फॉर पीस, आई एम गिविंग अप कीव, आई डोंट वांट कीव, आई डोंट वांट यूक्रेन. ओके, एंड दैट्स हाउ. हमें ज्यादा नहीं क्या करना है, हो गया, चलिए. Now, हमारे एग्जाम के लिए this much is enough. So this is about Turkey. लेकिन टर्की का आपको थोड़ा सा नीचे भी पता होना चाहिए. I'll come to क्या Turkey shares a border with, does Turkey share a border with Syria? Turkey does share a border with Syria. Why is this point important? Point is important because Turkish forces have played an important role in trying to even overthrow Bashar al-Assad's government in Syria at times in collaboration with the United States. Okay, so that's also there. So Turkey shares a border with Syria, ये आपको पता होना चाहिए. Does Turkey share a border with Israel? दिख रहा है आपको कहीं? Turkey doesn't share a border with Israel. Iran, yes. Iraq, yes. ठीक है. Now, आर्मेनिया, जॉर्जिया, आर्मेनिया और दूसरे और कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स बाद में, वो सेंट्रल एशिया में देख लेंगे. बट दिस इज वन कॉन्टेक्स्ट दैट यू शुड फर्स्टली नो. बाकी सो दिस इज एंड द क्रेच स्ट्रेट, मैंने बोल दिया था आपको, द सी ऑफ अजोव इज कनेक्टेड टू द ब्लैक सी थ्रू द क्रेच स्ट्रेट. ये आपको पता होना चाहिए. नेक्स्ट, लेट्स कम टू इजराइल. क्वेश्चंस कई बार आ चुके हैं इजराइल पे, और इसको रटने की जगह मैं थोड़ा सा बता देता हूं आपको. तो रटने को तो कुछ भी रट सकते हैं आदमी. देखिए, व्हेन यू लुक एट इजराइल एंड पैलेस्टीन कंबाइंड, अभी उसमें ना घुसे उन दोनों के अंदर बहुत ज्यादा, बट इजराइल एंड पैलेस्टीन कंबाइंड, इजराइल्स नेबर ऑन द वन साइड इज whom? Egypt. In fact, Egypt has often claimed to be the leader of the Arab world. देखिए, Egypt at different points of time in the past 100 years, Egypt has claimed that it is the leader of the Arab world. Before that, Turkey has claimed that it is the leader of the Arab world. Why? Because Turkey was the base of the Ottoman Empire. मतलब ये सऊदी, ये सीरिया, इराक, सऊदी अरेबिया, ये सब टर्की में से ही निकले. Why? Or they've all come out of the Ottoman Empire, to be more precise. And Turkey has been the base of the Ottoman Empire. So the Turkish say that we are the civilizational power of West Asia. That's their claim, that we are the ones who are the civilizational powers of West Asia. In fact, the Turkish ruler was also the Caliph for a long time. Okay, so the Turkish have claimed that they are civilizational powers of West Asia. Similarly, the Egyptians who built the pyramids and old civilizations, they say, if you look in Egypt, there's the Cairo University, which is one of the oldest universities, which has produced some of the most important scientific advancements that have been witnessed in West Asia in the 6th century AD and after that also. So देखिए, we are the civilizational power. उसके बाद कौन? Iran. Iran says that we are also the civilization, we are the civilizational powers of West Asia. Persian literature. If you look at Persian literature, if you look at Iran, Iran has been an independent state for more than 2000 years. Much before Ottoman Empire became a power, the Persian power was always there. Okay. Chahe before Islam also came, was born, Iran was always an independent state. If Islam came to rise in the 6th century AD, the Iranian state was great from the time of Darius the Great, 516 BC. बहुत पुरानी कहानी है ईरान की. तो इन सब में, and all of them have thousands of years of history, culture, language, heritage, etc. All of them claim to be the major powers. The youngest amongst them all is who? हाँ, इजराइल को तो हम नहीं बोल ही रहे सिविलाइजेशनल पावर. Saudi Arabia. In the Muslim world, if you were to say of West Asia, the 4 major powers today are Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia and Iran. Out of them, three are civilizational powers. Turkey, Egypt and Iran. One is not Saudi Arabia. If you look in culture, literature, food, anything, all of these are thousands of years of history. Saudi Arabia doesn't. It is a relatively young state. Okay. And that is something, but today it is one of the most prosperous state in terms of economy and in terms of oil and all. But that doesn't mean that these powers are not powerful. ये context इसलिए समझने का जरूरत है that Turkey says that we are the major rulers of West Asia. Iran also claims such a status, Saudi Arabia also claims, and Egypt in the past used to claim such a status, not right now. All of them have at different points of time threatened whom? Or have fought a war with Israel. Let's put it this way. 1967, Egypt and Israel fought a, देखिए लड़ाई तो कई बार हुई. 67 में ये इजराइल का ये कौन है, ये कौन नेबर? North of Israel is whom? Lebanon. ये जो छोटा सा है Lebanon. This is Syria. Iraq. ये does Saudi Arabia. So firstly, does Iraq share a land border with Israel? No. Does Turkey share a land border with Israel? No. Does Egypt share a land border with Israel? Yes. ये the Sinai Peninsula is a part of whom? Egypt. देखिए 1967 में जब लड़ाई हुई थी between Israel and its neighbors, तो इजराइल ने सबको बहुत धोया. 1948 and 1967, twice Israel, obviously with a strong support from the United States, went about asserting its military superiority vis-a-vis all its neighbors. 67 में Israel bombed the Egyptian Air Force even before it could take off. And Egyptian Air Force was destroyed by Israel, and Israel captured Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel also imposed a defeat on Jordan. Israel also imposed a defeat on Syria. From Syria, they captured what is called as the Golan Heights. ये यहां पे है Golan Heights. मैं भी बता दूंगा. I'll show you the detailed map. Golan Heights was Syrian territory, but who captured it? Israel. Sinai was Egyptian territory, but who captured it? Israel. Then Egypt and Israel reached a peace in what is called as the Camp David Accords. छोड़ दीजिए कौन से David Accord कुछ भी. In the 1970s they reached peace, and Egypt recognized Israel's right to exist as an independent state. The Egyptians recognized the right of Israel to exist as an independent state, and Israel returned Sinai to whom? Egypt. This is called negotiation. Israel doesn't want Sinai, but Israel captured it to use it as a negotiating chip in the later negotiation, and both sides secured peace with each other. It partly dented Egypt's claims of being the leader of the Arab world as it went ahead and signed a deal with Israel. Jordan, by the way, also shared a border, and Israel in the 1967 war attacked Palestinian territories on a large scale and forced a large number of Palestinians to seek refuge where? In Jordan. And in fact, today also a large number of Palestinians live as refugees where? In Jordan. Because Israel pushed out the Palestinians of their territories which are claimed by Israel into Jordan. Israel also occupied the Golan Heights, which it occupies to this day. Okay, and that is, ये भी सब पे क्वेश्चन आया हुआ है. गोलान हाइट्स पे क्वेश्चन आया हुआ है, सब पे कभी ना कभी क्वेश्चन आया और आएगा, बिकॉज दीज आर सम इंपॉर्टेंट वंस. क्वेश्चन यह है, Israel shares the borders with which of the countries? Now, it is in this context that if you look at this map, मैंने आपको मोस्ट चीजें तो बता दी हैं, बट इफ यू लुक एट दिस मैप, दिस इज द कंट्रीज. ठीक है, मैंने आपको मोस्ट चीजें तो बता दी हैं, ठीक है, Israel is here. This is the Sinai Peninsula. Right? ये गाजा स्ट्रिप एंड वेस्ट बैंक, ये सब पैलेस्टीन, जब हम इजराइल पढ़ेंगे इंडिया इजराइल रिलेशंस, तब हम वी कैन टॉक अबाउट ब्रीफली. द गाजा स्ट्रिप इज ऑन द वेस्टर्न साइड and the West Bank is on the eastern side. The West Bank is the west of whom? Is the west of the Jordan River. Okay, ये river है यहाँ, river कहाँ है river? ये रही river. ये Israel and Jordan are separated from by whom? The Jordan River, which itself connects the Sea of Galilee in the north with the Dead Sea in the south. Dead Sea में बहुत salinity है, you can float, है ना, फिर सुना होगा, पढ़ा होगा, देखा होगा. So the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea is and the Sea of Galilee basically are connected by the Jordan's river, which is a natural separation between whom? Israel and Jordan. But the north of Israel is here what? The Golan Heights region. And this is in the control of Israel. Further north of Israel is Lebanon. ठीक है, तो ये एक ब्रॉड मैप बेस्ड अंडरस्टैंडिंग आपको पता होना चाहिए. ओके, नाउ दैट्स अबाउट, माइंड यू, Israel is located for sea access very close to where? Israel is located very close to the Suez Canal. Okay, so that's there. By the way, does Israel share a border with Saudi Arabia? What do you think? Does Israel share a border with Saudi Arabia? थोड़ा ध्यान से देखते हैं. In Israel, if you look, I'm looking for the right map. I think if it's not here, then also. चलिए ऐसे समझ लीजिए. देखिए, Saudi Arabia is building a new city called the Neom city. Okay. Along the Red Sea, very close to the border with the Sinai Peninsula and Israel. Okay, though not directly connected by land, but very located close to it is the Neom project. अब जाके थोड़ा सा गूगल भी कर सकते हैं, मैंने यहाँ पे भी दिया हुआ है. It's a mega city project which is being built by Saudi Arabia on the western coast. Or not on the eastern coast, वहां तो oil fields हैं उनके, but on the western coast they're building this Neom city in Saudi Arabia, which is the dream project of their deputy ruler, who is next in line to be the next ruler. So you see, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is building this Neom project very close to this Red Sea and Israel, etc. also. And this is going to be a $500 billion project, okay, in which they're building practically a new city. In this city, Saudi laws will not apply. The restrictions which apply in the Saudi society, etc., will not apply. Saudi Arabia wants to build this as an international trade and finance center, much like London, okay, and so thus wants to have a very liberal economy, education, and everything in this Neom project. This is their grand project, which if implemented successfully will help them partly diversify away from oil. Please understand, the problem with many of the West Asian countries is what? That they are single product driven economies, right? Which is oil. As long as the oil prices are up, it's okay. But you see, during COVID period, oil prices were $30 a barrel, right? $30 a barrel. Now it's $130 a barrel, right? So now you should do CSAT. When $30 a barrel oil, petrol in India costed 70 rupees. So at $130 a barrel, अभी तो maybe they are waiting for some more time, but it is inevitable. Okay. What was not inevitable was that $30 a barrel should cost 70 rupees, but $130 a barrel will cost substantially higher. तो अब तो 100, 150, अब तो पहले I also used to believe कि सर 100 तो नहीं होगा क्रॉस, लोग कुछ तो कहेंगे, लेकिन अब लोगों ने कह दिया है कि सर 100 नहीं है 200 में बेचो, हम आपके साथ. सो दिस इज नाउ. आप वैसे मेरे पास गाड़ी है ही नहीं, एक बाइक हुआ करती थी, वो भी मैंने बहुत सालों पहले बेचनी थी, वो पड़ी है, सिंबॉलिक ऑफ माई पास्ट. एंड गोइंग फॉरवर्ड जितना भी बढ़ जाए कोई मेरे को तो फर्क पड़ना नहीं है, जिसके पास गाड़ी है उसको फर्क पड़ेगा. तो दैट इज देयर एंड इट इज हियर टू स्टे. Please understand that at least for 1 year, the oil prices will remain where they are. Okay. And that means the era of high inflation is here to stay. The thing is, but it is going to be a global phenomena. It is not just a India centric phenomena, but just like COVID was a global phenomena and it has adversely affected the world economy, but it has affected some economies more than the other. So that's another thing. Now NEOM 10, इसके बारे में आप थोड़ा बहुत चाहें तो कुछ पढ़ लीजिएगा, नॉट दैट बिग अ कंसर्न. कमिंग नेक्स्ट टू वेयर आई वांटेड टू ड्रॉ योर अटेंशन. ओह, इट्स ऑलरेडी 4:45, इज इट? तो लास्ट थिंग दैट आई वांटेड टू ड्रॉ योर अटेंशन इज द नॉर्थ ऑफ ईरान. चलिए वो नॉर्थ ऑफ ईरान पे हम बाद में ही बता दूंगा मैं आपको, लेट इट बी, लेट्स स्टॉप हियर. तो नेक्स्ट क्लास टुमारो मोस्ट लाइकली देयर विल बी अ ऑफ, मोस्ट लाइकली 16th, 17th एंड 18th. होली कल 16th है, होली इज 18th, जो भी 17th and 18th is holy definitely, right? So most likely 16th, 17th and 18th will be an off. मतलब 17th and 18th are definitely an off. वो तो है ही. यहाँ रोड पे निकलते हैं लोग, बच्चे ऐसे एकदम खड़े रहते हैं कि देख ही लेंगे तुम्हें तो, राइट? हाँ, तो that is it. 17th and 18th is an off. Most likely tomorrow also will be an off. You will get a mail. Please check your mail before coming tomorrow. One second. अच्छा, 18th is Friday. You check your mail tomorrow. All of you check your mail tomorrow. You'll have the schedule for the whole upcoming week and everything mentioned in it. You'll have the schedule. इसका मतलब ये नहीं बोल रहा हूं कि मैं नहीं है क्लास, because if we're giving a 3-day off, we may do the classes on Saturday and Sunday, especially for this week, so that we don't lag behind. Please check your mail. Thank you.